Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The rustling of the curtain was the only sound dancing through the room that evening, as Jessie sat curled up in the far corner of their faded gray couch, her body folded like a letter no one had the courage to read. The room smelled faintly of baby lotion and forgotten peace, and though the bulb overhead still burned with the stubbornness of an old habit, the warmth between her and Kaiser had long since fizzled into cold ash. He sat at the edge of the bed in their bedroom, back hunched, eyes fixed on nothing, yet everything inside him was screaming. The silence between them was no longer a bridge waiting to be crossed. It had become a ravine too wide to leap, carved by doubt and pride and wounds too old to be fresh, but too fresh to be forgotten. Their 3-year-old, Milo, had fallen asleep on the mat in the corner after dragging his toy car in circles till exhaustion took him. The baby, Jaden, lay in his cot, mouth twitching as though chasing dreams in a world that hadn't yet learned to disappoint him. Jessie had been watching Kaiser for weeks, waiting for him to say something, anything, but what he finally said the night before still rang in her head like a cracked bell in a quiet church. "I don't think that baby is mine." It wasn't the words that stunned her most, it was the way he said it. Calm, flat, as though he'd been saving them, practicing them until they sounded like truth. Her hands had trembled then, not with rage, but with the helpless ache of someone watching a house collapse from within and realizing the fire wasn't started by strangers, it was the man she'd built the walls with. The next morning came dressed in gray, as if the sky too was unsure whether to cry or hold its peace. Jessie stood by the window with a mug of tea that had gone cold in her hand, watching mothers walk their children to school with bags slung over tired shoulders. She remembered when she used to smile at such women, eager to join their ranks, proud to build a home where love lived in the corners. 6 years with Kaiser had taught her that love wasn't a straight road. It was a winding path paved with both laughter and landmines. And yet nothing had prepared her for the way he now looked at their younger son, as if searching for a ghost in a mirror. She remembered the months after their brief breakup, the lonely ache that had driven her into another man's arms. It was a momentary lapse, a reckless reach for warmth when her heart had gone cold. But even then, she hadn't been careless. She had counted the dates like a woman trying to find her way through a forest of blame. She remembered the timeline with the clarity of someone who knew what was at stake. March 25th, still tangled with the past. March 28th, the day she and Kaiser stitched themselves back together with kisses and promises neither of them would say aloud. From April 5th, the tests came back negative, but by April 15th, 2 faint lines screamed louder than any argument. She had held the stick in her trembling hand, whispering to it, please let it be his, not because of shame, but because she knew she had found her way back to the only man she wanted to raise her children with. When Jessie confronted him that afternoon, the weight of her voice pressed down on the small living room like a collapsing ceiling. "You think he's not yours?" she asked, her tone steady, but her eyes shining with unshed betrayal. Kaiser looked up from his phone, his face unreadable, the kind of expression worn by men who knew they were about to hurt someone but couldn't summon the courage to soften the blow. "Jess," he said, dragging her name like a man reluctant to leave a room. "You were with someone else. What do you expect me to think?" His voice wasn't cruel. It was tired, lined with the exhaustion of a man who'd chewed on suspicion until it turned bitter. "March 28th to April 15th, she said firmly, tossing down a bundle of printed screenshots and a pregnancy test. "That's when I was with you. Every single day. And April 5th, negative. April 15th, positive. That's not his baby, Kaiser. It's yours. You just don't want to believe it." Kaiser scoffed, stood up, paced the length of the room like a lion caged in his own ego. "What about April 3rd? He shot back. "You think I forgot? You left the house. You said you needed space. And then I saw you at the junction, getting into his car. That's not a fairy tale, Jessie. That's evidence. Her voice cracked then, like glass held too tightly. I went there to end it properly. We didn't do anything. You think I'd risk everything I came back to for one more night with someone I didn't even love? Kaiser turned his back, rubbed his forehead, but didn't answer. Because when trust breaks, even the truth feels like a lie. That evening, Jessie sat with her baby on her lap, watching as his tiny fingers reached for her earrings with the fascination only children could afford. His giggles filled the air, innocent and unaware, and all she could think of was how much he looked like Kaiser when he smiled, cheeks puffed, dimple peeking, a joy that came in bursts like sunshine after rain. She remembered how Kaiser had cried when Milo was born, how he had whispered promises into the boy's ears before he could even understand language. But now, with Jaden, there was only distance. He changed diapers like a man clocking into a shift he didn't apply for. He held the baby like a borrowed item, delicate, unsure, unwilling to get too attached. Jessie had had enough. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she never thought she'd call, Barrister Elfrida. If he wanted proof, she'd give him more than proof. She'd take him to court. Not because she wanted to shame him, but because she wanted to protect the truth. She'd had enough of whispers, enough of suspicion coloring every glance, enough of walking on eggshells in a house she helped build. The baby didn't deserve to grow up in doubt's shadow. The next morning, she served him court papers with hands that trembled but didn't flinch, and as he opened the envelope, Kaiser let out a long, winded laugh, not because it was funny, but because deep down, something in him had already cracked. What he didn't expect was that even the courtroom would find itself wrestling with questions only the heart could answer. Kaiser sat on the narrow bench outside the registrar's office, fingers curled together like a man holding his own silence hostage. The crumpled court papers sat beside him, unread for the third day in a row. He had glanced at the words, seen his name in bold beside Jessie's, and felt something heavy shift in his chest, like a stone being moved in a dark room with no doors. Milo was at daycare. Jaden was with Jessie, probably crawling over her tired legs and tugging at her wrapper like he did most afternoons. And here he was, chewing on his regrets like dry cola, bitter and clinging to the back of his throat. Kaiser was the kind of man who didn't like drama. He preferred silence over shouting, cold shoulders over confrontations. But this was war. Jessie had gone and dragged him into a courtroom to prove he was the father of a child who, in his heart, he wasn't sure he wanted to reject. He hated how her voice cracked that day in the living room, hated how she reached for the calendar, held it up like a Bible, swore on dates and timelines as though logic alone could undo what doubt had already poisoned. The pain wasn't just about the baby, it was about everything. The 3-month break, the other guy, the way she came back into his life without bringing the full weight of her truth. And now, standing before legal walls, she wanted to use the court like a scalpel to carve out clarity. But clarity had never been Kaiser's strong suit. He thrived in the gray areas, half love, half truth, half trust. And now the gray was fading fast, giving way to a harsh spotlight that didn't care who flinched first. Jessie, on the other hand, didn't flinch at all. Her hands shook, yes, when she fed Jaden, when she bathed Milo, when she signed her name on the court affidavit, but her resolve was as steady as a drumbeat in the dark. She didn't take Kaiser to court out of revenge. She did it because she was drowning in a sea of unsaid things. Their home had become a haunted place. Every smile from Jaden met with side eyes, every cry weighed against suspicion. She had reached her wit's end when Kaiser started sleeping in the living room for no reason, saying work tired him out when they both knew the truth sat crying in a cot beside their bed. He was scared. She could see it in his footsteps, the way he hesitated before picking Jaden up, as if love could be switched off by doubt. And in that hesitation, Jessie saw something dangerous, a future where the boy grew up asking why his father looked through him instead of at him. She couldn't live with that. She'd rather strip her truth bare and let strangers in black robes and white wigs dissect her life than let her child be raised under a roof built with broken trust. When she filed the motion, the clerk asked her twice if she wanted to proceed. "Do you have any doubt yourself?" the woman asked, her pen hovering above the form. Jessie didn't blink. "I know who the father is. It's the man who held me when I was scared, who kissed my stretch marks after Milo, who cried when I went into labor. He's forgotten who he is, but I haven't." Her voice didn't rise, but it echoed, even in her own ears. The first court session was more awkward than hostile. The judge, a woman in her 50s with stern glasses and a voice that could peel paint off walls, sat at the center like a queen in a chess match no one asked to play. Kaiser and Jessie sat on opposite sides, their lawyers whispering strategy, but neither of them hearing a word. Jessie wore a plain blue gown that softened her figure but couldn't mask the exhaustion around her eyes. Kaiser wore his only blazer, the one from Milo's naming ceremony, though it hung looser now. Time and tension had thinned him out. The judge began with calm questions: name, age, relationship history, date of reunion. It felt less like a trial and more like a peeling, layer after layer of what they were, laid bare before strangers. Jessie listed out the dates she'd printed and rehearsed: March 25th, still with the other man. March 28th, reconciled with Kaiser. April 5th, negative test. April 15th, positive. "He and I had been together for over 19 days, she said quietly. "The man I was with before, I hadn't seen him in nearly 3 weeks by then. I only went to return something on April 3rd, and nothing happened. I swear that under oath." Kaiser's lawyer leaned over, whispered something sharp, but Kaiser held up his hand. "She went back to the other guy," he said, not angrily, but like someone stating the shape of a wound. "Even if it was just for a day, isn't that worth questioning?" The judge stared at them both for a moment longer than necessary, then sighed. "Sometimes," she said, "the questions aren't about facts, but fear. And fear doesn't hold up in court. We need evidence, not emotion." Outside the courtroom that day, the world carried on as though no hearts had been pulled apart inside those pale walls. Vendors shouted prices for roast corn and groundnuts. A group of teenagers kicked a flat football across the dusty field beside the court, and somewhere a woman laughed too loudly into her phone. But inside Kaiser, something was breaking, quietly, invisibly, like a string inside a piano that no longer sang. He hadn't expected to feel anything. He thought court would numb him, give him distance. But hearing Jessie say his name on the stand, watching her shield their baby from the fluorescent lights overhead, something inside him recoiled from the very doubt he had built like a wall around himself. He remembered Jaden's laugh the night before, how it cracked through the room like a sudden firecracker, unprovoked, pure. And he remembered Jessie saying, "He laughs like you know." He'd brushed it off then. But now it stuck, like a seed wedged in the corner of his mind. Jaden was starting to babble, almost too clearly for a 6-month-old. And Jessie, in a moment of almost desperate pride, told the judge he was born with teeth, just like his father. The courtroom chuckled. The judge raised a brow. "You mean Mr. Emanuel?" Jessie nodded firmly. "Yes, Kaiser was born with teeth." "It's rare, but it's true." The judge turned to Kaiser, who blinked in confusion. "Is that so?" she asked. Kaiser nodded slowly. "That's what my mother told me." And suddenly the courtroom didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a maze. One where every twist was a memory and every dead end was a fear Kaiser didn't know how to face. The week that followed the first court session unspooled like a thread from a torn wrapper, slow, messy, and full of snags no one saw coming. Kaiser found himself drifting through his days like a ghost trapped in his own routine. He still opened the pharmacy at the junction by 9 a.m., still arranged the shelves with robotic precision, still smiled at familiar customers, but his mind was never present. Every rattle of a pill bottle reminded him of Jaden's laughter. Every child who came in for vitamins made him see the baby's face superimposed on theirs. He wasn't ready to admit it to himself, but something in him had begun to loosen, like an old knot finally considering a release. The memory of Jessie's voice in court haunted him more than he wanted to confess, not because of her words, but because of how much she had to fight to be believed by the man she once laid beside every night. And despite his quiet defiance, he couldn't shake the moment when the judge asked about the teething. It wasn't something you could forge or fake. His mother, long before she passed, used to joke about it. "You came into this world already biting," she'd say. "No wonder your mouth always has something to say." It was a rare condition, too rare, he now realized, to be dismissed. And the more he replayed the timeline Jessie provided, the more something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been fair. But fairness was never easy for wounded men. Pride builds its throne from denial, and Kaiser had been king of that castle for months. To admit he may have been wrong was to dismantle the one thing he had leaned on for emotional survival, his doubt. Jessie noticed the shift in Kaiser before he could name it himself. Though they barely spoke now, she caught glimpses of it in the way his eyes lingered on Jaden during Milo's school pickups. Once, when she stepped outside to get water, she returned to see Kaiser squatting beside Jaden's pram, just watching the baby stretch his arms toward the sun filtering through the frangipani tree in the front yard. He didn't say a word when she walked past him, but he didn't move either. He remained there for several long seconds, as if he were learning the shape of his son's joy, memorizing it. At night, she lay in bed unable to sleep, not because of guilt, but because of exhaustion, mental, emotional, maternal. Her mother called often now, gently encouraging her not to back down from the court proceedings. If he doubts, let him know the truth in public. Let the shame fall where it must, the older woman said. But Jessie didn't want shame. She wanted peace. She wanted her children to grow up without this fog of confusion. She wanted Milo to remember that his parents once held hands across the dinner table. That laughter used to live here. She wanted Jaden to grow up calling Kaiser Daddy, without someone wondering if it should be in quotation marks. But most of all, she wanted to stop fighting. Her entire life had begun to feel like a courtroom, every smile cross-examined, every memory under scrutiny. She found herself doubting her own instincts, wondering if maybe she had misjudged something. The only thing she never doubted was the baby's paternity. She knew the truth. What she couldn't predict was whether truth would be enough to melt the stone that had replaced Kaiser's heart. It was during the second court session that the atmosphere finally changed, just slightly, but enough for the room to hold its breath. The judge, now more curious than skeptical, ordered the court-appointed pediatric specialist to speak. The doctor, a gentle man with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like sandpaper on silk, stepped forward with a folder tucked under his arm. "Natal teeth," he began, "are rare. Fewer than 1 in every 2,000 births." He flipped the folder open and pulled out a photograph of Jaden taken during his initial examination. A murmur rippled through the room. 2 small teeth, perfectly formed, were visible in the baby's lower gum. "This condition is not only rare, but also strongly linked to hereditary factors," the doctor continued. "And after speaking with the mother and reviewing family history, we were told that the presumed father, Mr. Kaiser Emanuel, was also born with natal teeth." The judge leaned forward, chin resting on folded fingers. "Is this something that can be used to infer paternity?" The doctor hesitated, then said carefully, "Not definitively. But the odds of 2 unrelated individuals both being born with this condition and then passing it to the same child are extremely low." Kaiser felt something cold sweep over him, followed by a heat he couldn't explain. His chest rose and fell as if he'd just run a mile uphill. He looked across the room, and Jessie's eyes met his for the first time in weeks. No anger, no gloating. Just that same look she gave him when Milo first said Dada. Hope without demand. belief without pressure. And in that silent exchange, something in Kaiser cracked, not broken, but softened. After court that day, Kaiser didn't go straight home. He wandered aimlessly around Milford's town center, hands in his pockets, head full of noise he didn't know how to mute. He stopped by the park, where school children were chasing one another with the kind of reckless joy only youth could afford. He sat on the bench near the mango tree, the same one he and Jessie had sat under years ago, the day she first told him she was pregnant with Milo. He could still remember the way her voice shook when she said, "I think we're having a baby," and how he had laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was terrifying and wonderful. That memory ambushed him now, bringing with it a sense of loss he hadn't acknowledged until that moment. He missed Jessie. He missed the version of her that giggled in her sleep, who danced while cooking, who rubbed his back when life felt too heavy. And more painfully, he missed the version of himself who believed in those moments. He wanted that man back. As the sky darkened and the first hints of twilight painted the clouds in hues of purple and gold, Kaiser whispered under his breath, "Please let that baby be mine." Not out of pride anymore, not out of fear of what people would say, but out of longing. A longing to belong. A longing to build again what had been slowly dismantled by silence and ego. He didn't know what the DNA test would say, but for the first time he admitted something he hadn't dared to speak until now. He wanted it to say yes. The third court session began under a low sky, the clouds hanging like soaked blankets waiting to burst open. Inside the courtroom, the air was stiff with expectation, the kind that makes even the ceiling fans turn slower, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Jessie arrived first, wearing a loose ivory blouse and ankle-length black skirt, her face clean, her eyes unreadable. Her lawyer, Elfrida, whispered something to her, but she barely nodded. She wasn't interested in legal jargon anymore. All she wanted was for truth to sit still long enough for everyone to see it. When Kaiser walked in, his presence sent a ripple across the courtroom, not because he wore anything new, but because his posture had shifted. He walked in like a man with questions, not a man with accusations. For the first time in weeks, he looked at Jessie, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with something slower, quieter, more complicated. The judge noticed it too, her brow lifted slightly, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses, reading what wasn't said. Then she called forward the court-appointed geneticist. A slim, dark-skinned man with a clipped British-Nigerian accent took the stand, carrying a sealed manila envelope that looked far too thin to carry so much weight. The courtroom hushed as he addressed the court, the paternity results for baby Jaden Emmanuel already. At that moment, Jessie gripped the edge of her seat like a cliff. Kaiser folded his arms, but his fingers tapped against his arm rhythmically, betraying the storm in his chest. The judge took the envelope, turned it in her hands as if its weight had suddenly increased, and cleared her throat. "Before I read this," she said slowly, "I want to remind both parties, whatever the result, the child remains innocent. What is decided here must guide your next actions, not poison them." Kaiser stared at the judge, his throat dry, his mind a chaotic whirlpool of prayers and panic. He had imagined this moment 100 times, rehearsed how he'd feel, what he'd say, how he'd react. But now that it was here, all those rehearsals fell apart like wet paper in his mind. The judge opened the envelope carefully, peeled back the flap, and removed the white sheet of paper inside. Her eyes moved across the page slowly, then she looked up. "According to the DNA analysis," she began, her voice neutral as stone, "Mr. Kaiser Emmanuel is not the biological father of the child, Jaden Emmanuel." There was no gasp, no dramatic cry, no chair falling over, just silence, deep and suffocating. Jessie's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her hands moved to her lap as though shielding her womb from a blow. Kaiser blinked once, then again. His body didn't move, but inside it felt as though something ancient had cracked. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shocked. He was strangely sad. A kind of sadness that doesn't ask for pity, but simply settles into the bones like cold. He looked at Jessie. Her face had gone pale, not with guilt but disbelief. "No," she muttered, barely above a whisper. "That can't be right." The judge turned to the doctor again, but he had nothing to add. "The test has been run twice," the man said gently. "Same result." Jessie stood slowly, the motion almost dreamlike. "I was only with Kaiser," she said, her voice hollow with heartbreak. "After March 28th, I was only with him. I swear on my life, I never touched the other man again. I don't know how this is possible." Kaiser didn't interrupt her. He just sat there, staring not at her, but at the floor, as though trying to trace the steps backward through time to find the single moment that had unraveled everything. The court released them for the day, and the legal process wound itself into a long chain of paperwork and whispers. But outside the four walls of that courtroom, emotions brewed like a storm on the edge of a tired sky. Jessie sat alone that evening, on the veranda of her mother's compound, holding Jaden to her chest. The baby cooed and played with the button on her blouse, oblivious to the weight his tiny presence carried. Tears rolled down Jessie's face, not loud or dramatic, but soft like a leaking tap that had forgotten how to turn off. Her mother came out with a shawl and placed it gently over her shoulders. "If the child is not Kaiser's," she said quietly, "then whose is he?" Jessie shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I swear I don't know, Mama. I thought I knew. I was sure. The tests, the timing, everything pointed to Kaiser. How can I be wrong about this?" Her mother sighed, that long, drawn breath of women who had seen too many wars of the heart. "Sometimes the truth hides in places shame has locked away. Maybe something happened, Jessie. Something you don't remember. Or don't want to remember." But Jessie shook her head again, more firmly this time. "I wasn't with him. Not after that day. Not after April 3rd. Her mother didn't press. She simply placed a hand on her daughter's back and rocked her gently, as if Jessie herself had turned back into a child who needed soothing. Inside, Jaden babbled to himself, his sounds echoing in the small room where Milo slept curled up like a comma. That night, Jessie didn't dream, but when she woke, her pillow was damp. Kaiser didn't sleep that night either. He sat by the window of his small apartment, staring out at the neon signboard of a nearby tailoring shop that blinked on and off, as if caught in some mechanical sigh. He held a picture of Milo in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling aimlessly through photos of Jaden. Every smile, every wrinkle of the baby's nose, every flicker of a grin, it all pulled at something inside him that no DNA result could cancel. He remembered the time Jaden fell asleep on his chest, arms sprawled like a cross, and how his tiny breath warmed the skin just beneath Kaiser's collarbone. He had loved that child. Even through the fog of doubt, even through the cracks in their relationship, he had loved him. But now the facts were standing in the middle of the room like a stubborn guest. The child wasn't his, and yet his heart refused to walk away. He called his sister, Loda, the one person who didn't judge him in halves. When she answered, he said only one thing: "I don't know what to do." She was quiet for a moment and asked, "Do you love the boy?" Kaiser sighed, his voice catching in the net of his own feelings. "Yes, God help me, I do." Loda's voice softened. "Then that's what matters. You can't change the facts, but you can choose your truth." After the call, Kaiser went into the living room where Jaden's small blanket still lay on the couch. He picked it up, pressed it to his face, and wept. Not because of betrayal, not even because of confusion, but because somewhere deep in his soul, he had begun to realize fatherhood wasn't just about blood. It was about who stayed when the truth didn't. The days that followed the DNA result unfolded like a silent funeral, grief without ceremony, pain without condolences. Jessie moved through her routines in slow motion, a ghost haunting her own home. She bathed Jaden with trembling hands, dressed Milo for school with a half-smile that never reached her eyes, and returned to her room only to sit in the quiet, staring at nothing. It was a strange ache, this kind of loss, the kind where no one had died, but something inside her had been declared non-existent. She had never imagined a world where she would have to convince the man she loved that her truth was truth enough and still lose. It wasn't the result that stung the most, it was the doubt, the insinuation that maybe, just maybe, she had slept through her own sin. Her mind went back over every moment from those chaotic months, the phone calls, the tears, the breakup, the brief comfort she found in another man's company. She had convinced herself that her closure with the other man was complete, sealed and sent off like a parcel no longer needed. But now, the lingering question clawed at her. What if her memory had missed something? What if she had been too eager to believe her own intentions could rewrite biology? Her mother kept asking questions gently, nudging her to go over her recollections again, but Jessie had reached the end of her introspection. She had replayed the film of her past until the reel broke. Whether or not the facts aligned with her feelings no longer mattered. The verdict had already stained her love story like red wine on white cloth. Milo had begun to sense the shift in the household even though no one had uttered a word to him about courtrooms or paternity. Children, after all, have a way of reading the air, like birds predicting rain before the first drop falls. He stopped asking why Daddy didn't come by as often, and instead started pretending his toys could talk. Jessie overheard him one evening whispering to his action figures, "Daddy said he'll come next week." He promised. Her heart broke quietly in her chest. She didn't want to take Kaiser to court again, not for child support, not for visitation rights. She didn't want Jaden to be treated like a broken clause and a failed contract. She just wanted to breathe again without her chest tightening at every thought of him. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't erase Kaiser from their lives, not from Milo's heart, not from her memory, and not from the boy who looked less and less like a stranger every time he smiled. Jaden had begun to call her Ma, and one day, while Milo was playing with his blocks, the baby crawled toward the doorway and let out a small sound. "Dad," Jessie froze. The word was barely formed, just a breath wrapped in a syllable, but it was clear. She waited, unsure whether to feel vindicated or crushed. That evening, as she fed Jaden pap in a pink plastic bowl, she thought about what it meant to be a mother who knew something no test could explain. The child she carried, the child she nursed, the child whose breathing she listened to like a lullaby. How could he not be hers and his? Even science, with all its cold, clean precision, couldn't measure what the heart insisted was true. She considered reaching out to Kaiser again, but fear clamped her fingers. If he chose distance, she wouldn't chase. She had done enough of that already. Kaiser, meanwhile, was caught between the jagged teeth of pride and tenderness. He didn't know which cut deeper, the shame of being wrong or the regret of being right. He spent more time at the pharmacy now, even taking night shifts he usually avoided. He claimed it helped pay bills, but really, he needed somewhere to hide from the sound of his own thoughts. At night, he would sit behind the counter after closing, resting his head on the receipt book, staring at old pictures on his phone. There was one of Jessie asleep on the couch with Jaden curled up on her chest, both of them breathing in rhythm, like music and harmony. He hadn't deleted it. Couldn't bring himself to. Loda called one night, asking him when he'd return to himself. "You've turned this guilt into a religion," she told him. "You've made an altar out of your suspicion, and now you're praying to your own hurt." Her words stung more than she knew. Kaiser wanted to forget what happened, to bury the court and the paperwork under the weight of time, but Jaden's face haunted him. That laugh, that light in his eyes, the way his little hand once wrapped tightly around Kaiser's pinky, all of it whispered, "You are mine." And that whisper, no matter how softly spoken, drowned out the thunder of logic. He hadn't seen the boy in days, but every night he imagined holding him again. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about presence. And what terrified Kaiser most was the possibility that in trying to protect himself from a lie, he might have let go of something true. When Sunday came around, the sun seemed to rise slower, as though the morning was unsure whether to shine or hide. Kaiser found himself walking without direction, letting his legs decide. They led him to Jessie Street, a place he hadn't visited since the last court date. He stood across the road for a long while, unsure if he was ready to knock, unsure if he even had the right. But then, as if fate had grown impatient, the front door opened. Jessie stepped out with a wrapper tied around her chest, and Jaden strapped to her back. She didn't see him at first. She was coaxing Milo to carry his backpack properly. Kaiser watched from behind a parked tricycle, his heart thudding against his ribs like a prisoner begging to be freed. Then Jaden turned his head, as though sensing something, and their eyes locked. The baby blinked. Then he giggled. Loud. Free. Unmistakably familiar. Jessie turned around quickly, following his gaze. Her eyes met Kaiser's. No words. Just a long look across an emotional bridge too wide for small talk. But in that moment, something passed between them. Something old, something tender. Kaiser raised his hand in greeting. Jessie nodded. And Jaden, still giggling, reached backward, as if asking to be carried by someone who had already walked away too many times. Kaiser took a step forward, then stopped. Jessie said nothing. But her silence, for once, wasn't angry. It was open. Like a door left slightly ajar on a windy evening, daring someone to come in and stay this time. Kaiser stood at the threshold of Jessie's compound like a man knocking not just on a door, but on the past he left ajar. The wooden gate creaked faintly as he pushed it open, greeted by the earthy smell of wet sand and the distant chatter of neighborhood children playing tin-tin near the corner. A small plastic chair sat beside the hibiscus shrub, and on it lay a baby's cup, half filled with water. It was strange how the ordinary things in that compound, the uneven cement floor, the hanging laundry fluttering like quiet prayers, seemed to scold him more than any words could. Jessie was in the backyard, hanging clothes. She didn't flinch when he called her name. She just turned slowly, eyes shaded by her brows, lips pressed together as though weighing whether this was a visit or another goodbye. I saw him laugh, Kaiser said, voice softer than the wind. Yesterday. I saw it from across the road. I know that laugh. Jessie didn't answer immediately. She removed a peg from her mouth, used it to pin a wet shirt, and turned fully toward him. He laughed because Milo told him you were coming, she replied, eyes not hard, not warm either, just watchful. Kaiser walked closer, each step feeling like he was treading across broken eggshells. I don't have a case anymore, he said. No court, no argument. I came because I've made peace with the facts. But my heart still argues. Jessie looked at him for a long time, then exhaled deeply, as though releasing a breath she'd held for months. You want to see him? She asked. He nodded. She led him through the back door into the room, where Jaden was seated in a walker, slapping his hands on the tray and babbling to himself. When he saw Kaiser, his whole face lit up like a bulb catching current. He reached forward, not just out of instinct, but out of memory. That was the moment something inside Kaiser broke, but this time it didn't shatter. It melted. Jessie watched from the corner of the room as Kaiser lifted Jaden from the walker, his large hands trembling slightly as they found rhythm around the baby's small frame. Jaden giggled, bouncing in his arms as if no time had passed. Kaiser held the boy close, pressing his cheek against the baby's warm head, breathing in that familiar powdery scent of baby lotion and innocence. I missed you, little man, he whispered, and though Jaden didn't understand the words, he responded with a tiny hand tugging at Kaiser's earlobe, laughing again. It was a sound Jessie hadn't heard in days, free, full, and real. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on them, unsure whether to smile or weep. I won't lie to you, Kaiser, she said slowly. I've questioned myself. I've turned every moment inside out. But even now, with that result in front of us, I still feel in my spirit that he's yours. Maybe not in blood, but in everything else. Kaiser didn't respond immediately. He sat on the floor with Jaden in his lap, legs crossed like an old habit, rocking the baby gently. You know, he said, his voice distant, when I was young, my uncle used to say, the man who feeds a child shapes his laugh. The one who stays gives the child his voice. He looked up at Jessie then, eyes glassy but calm. I think I want to give him mine. Jessie said nothing. She didn't need to. Them, not out of tension, but awe, the quiet reverence that comes when pride gives way to grace. In the weeks that followed, the story of Kaiser and Jessie no longer ran on courtroom paper. It ran on ordinary days, quiet apologies, and the unspoken language of effort. They didn't rush into titles. There were no declarations, no quick returns to romance. They became co-parents, but not in name alone, in truth. Kaiser began stopping by more often, first under the guise of dropping off things for Milo, then with small gestures for Jaden. Diapers, baby shoes, a rattle shaped like a lion. He'd stay a little longer each visit, helping feed Jaden, sometimes staying to carry Milo on his shoulders down the street. The neighbors noticed, but no one whispered this time. The silence around their story had shifted from judgment to respect. Jessie's heart, though still bruised, began to bloom again. She no longer waited by the phone, but when Kaiser called, she answered with a softness that surprised her. One evening, as they sat in the compound under a sky bruised with sunset, Milo ran up to them breathless, laughing, "Daddy!" Jaden said, "Dada," again. Kaiser chuckled, rubbing his son's head, while Jessie just looked at him with something warmer than forgiveness, recognition. Not of the man she once loved, but the one he was becoming. I still don't understand everything, Kaiser admitted, eyes on the sky. But I know what I feel when I look at him. That has to mean something. Jessie nodded. Sometimes it's not the answer we were looking for. It's the feeling that refused to leave. Their story wasn't fixed, but it was healing, and that, they were learning, was a miracle in itself. By the end of the third month, Kaiser had taken a bold step. He invited Jessie and the boys to his mother's memorial. It was an informal family gathering, nothing extravagant, just a few relatives at the old compound. Jessie hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, knowing that sometimes reconciliation happens not in courtrooms, but under mango trees and beside steaming pots of jollof. At the gathering, Jaden was passed from aunt to cousin to uncle, each one commenting on how much he looked like Kaiser as a baby. No one brought up the test. No one dared. What they saw was a man carrying a child as if every step counted, as if the child were holding onto his breath and not just his shoulder. At one point, Kaiser stood beside the family photograph hung in the hallway, his late mother's favorite frame, and placed Jaden's hand on the glass. "That's your grandma," he said. Jaden smiled, his reflection merging with hers in the photo. Jessie stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching the scene as her chest swelled with something too deep to name. That night, as they left the compound and walked toward the main road to catch a kiki, Kaiser paused. "Jess," he said gently, "I may never know how or why the result came the way it did, but what I know is this: if loving him is a choice, then I'll choose him every single day." Jessie looked at him long and hard, then smiled. A small one, but real. "Then start tomorrow," she said. "He wakes up at 5. They both laughed, quietly, honestly. The kind of laugh that meant something had been rebuilt. Not perfectly, but beautifully. And this time, they didn't walk apart. Sometimes, love is tested in ways we never prepared for. Like Jessie and Kaiser, people can find themselves caught between truth and proof, between what their heart knows and what the world insists on seeing. In relationships, doubt can creep in through tiny cracks, moments of miscommunication, seasons of pain, wounds that were never properly bandaged. And if we're not careful, we begin to treat those we love like suspects instead of companions. But here's the thing. Healing is louder than heartbreak when pride is silenced. Kaiser didn't need a courtroom to teach him love. He needed time, honesty, and the humility to see what his heart had been trying to say all along. And Jessie? She showed us that standing firm in your truth doesn't mean being stubborn. It means holding your ground with grace, even when no one claps for you. To everyone listening, if you've ever been misunderstood, don't let it harden you. If you've ever doubted someone you once trusted, don't let it blind you. Healing isn't always about being right. It's about being real. Sometimes, what we thought was a test ends up being a mirror. Look into it. Forgive, if you must. Stay, if it's safe. Leave, if it's wise. But whatever you do, don't build your future on broken assumptions. Be the one who loves courageously, not cautiously. Thank you for the power of love that survives the storms we never expected. Thank you for second chances, for softened hearts, and for quiet miracles that unfold not in thunder but in whispers. Lord, we lift every listener who has been tested by life, those walking through misunderstandings, heartbreak, or seasons of doubt. For those carrying wounds caused by broken trust, pour out healing like rain on dry land. For those whose faith in love is wearing thin, renew their strength like the eagles. Give them eyes to see beyond pain, and ears to hear truth through the noise. Father, teach us to forgive quickly, to love patiently, and to speak gently even when our hearts are trembling. Remind us that family isn't always tied by blood, but by those who choose to stay when it's easier to walk away. Help us to let go of our need to be right and hold tightly to our call to be kind. We pray for every child caught in confusion, every mother carrying silent tears, and every father wrestling with uncertainty. Be their peace in the chaos. Be their clarity in the fog. Be their guide when the map tears in their hands. And for those praying for restoration, Lord, breathe life into what's grown cold. Bring back laughter into dry homes. Touch hard hearts with your mercy, and replace bitterness with beauty. Let the healing begin from the inside out. Let love win where pride once reigned. Let peace settle where doubt once shouted. In Jesus' name we pray, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.